All right, happy to Randy. I'll fill in.
Yes.
Congrats on Sunday.
All right, Captain.
There you go.
Where's my battery looking like?
Sorry?
Oh, my battery. Don't want to die again.
Is everyone good for me to drop the speech trap?
Just dropping it?
Yeah, I'm dropping it. It's up to everyone.
Okay. Getting my timer up and should I open, preview? Cool, I got access.
All right, well, then we'll start. Ban private spending. Quote, observation one is inherent. Public financing for presidential campaigns exists, but nobody uses it. Smith 22. The Federal Election Campaign Act provided public funding for elections for presidential cycles for 6 election cycles from 76 to 96. Public financing worked well. Availability of public financing encouraged transparency in campaign funding and sharply reduced the influence of public donors. Since 2008, no presidential campaign has used any public financing system at all. Today, more than $300 million in public funds for campaigns sits unused because of candidates' refusal to accept spending limits required to qualify for public funds. Thus, the plan. The U.S. federal government should ban private spending in presidential campaigns. The solvency, a restriction on private campaign spending forced public financing to be the only possible option. Amy 2020. The most obvious solution for our campaign finance problems is to follow the example of other democracies, limit campaign spending, ban outside spending, and require public funding, which we all know can lessen the undue influence of wealthy interests on elections. Reform groups have proposed the constitutional amendments that would allow greater restrictions on campaign spending and overturn the court's rulings banning such laws. Such amendments would be a huge breakthrough and pave the way for adopting new laws to rein outside spending and provide for public financing. But public financing is still the golden standard for getting private money out of elections. Advantage one is democracy. Private spending dismantles democracy through the chilling effect on voters. Opposite 2012. The poll finds that outside spending has given rise to significant bipartisan fears of corruption and distrust in government. 1 in 4 Americans are less likely to vote this year due to fears that candidates cater to the interests of super PAC donors over the public interest. Less wealthy and less educated Americans were significantly more likely to say that they would be less likely to vote because of super PAC influence. 41% of respondents believe that their vote doesn't matter very much due to big donors and super PACs that have more influence, and only 1 in 5 Americans on the average voter believe that we have the same access to candidates. Now, even bigger, 2 out of 3 Americans, which is 65%, say that their trust in government is less because of big donors and super PACs have more influence than regular voters. Next, American democracy cannot survive with the current campaign finance framework in 2020. For election to be fully democratic, several conditions must hold. Citizens must have an equal amount of power to decide who is elected. So again, democratic elections must also be fair races, and American elections fail to fulfill both these criteria because the problems of the way they're financed.
Excuse me? I'm so sorry. I'm one of the judges, but I need to grab for paper. Can you start over?
Yeah.
I'm so sorry.
We thought that was
Thank you.
That's why I was confused why we were starting, because the issues.
Thank you.
I thought shadow the judges here. That's
That's why when I checked in the beginning, I always saw 2 hands come up.
Yeah, right.
Yeah. I'm like,
No, you're totally good. That's my bad.
you're good. That's what I thought. That's Eliza.
Okay.
Sorry, guys. All right.
No, that's not the start.
I'll start. Sorry,
Just
people
missed the head
online.
chair.
It's okay. I don't even know how, but it's okay. Sorry, this
Did we start without a judge?
Yeah,
Looks like
Yeah,
it.
they're gonna read it.
So we're gonna start again.
yes.
Next time, wait for all your judges. Judges. Make sure they're all 3 there.
Or should have a hat that says judge. So they
Simple
know.
way to check, you know. Are all my judges here?
Okay.
Thanks, folks.
So, from the top.
Sorry, dude.
Ban private spending. Observation 1 is inherent. Public financing for presidential campaigns exists, but nobody uses it. Smith 22. The Federal Election Campaign Act provide public funds for elections from presidential campaigns for 6 election cycles from 76 to 96. Public financing work well. The availability of public financing encourage transparency in campaign funding and sharply reduce the influence of wealthy donors. Since 2008, no presidential candidate has used a public financing system at all. And today, more than $300 million of public funds for campaigns is unused because candidates refuse to accept spending limits required to qualify for public funds. Thus, the plan. The U.S. federal government should ban private spending in presidential campaigns. The solvency, a restriction on private campaign spending forces public financing to be the only option in 2020. The most obvious solution to our campaign finance problem is to follow the example of other democracies. Limit campaign spending, ban asset spending, and require public funding for all those which we know can lessen undue influence on wealthy interests on elections. Reform groups have proposed that constitutional amendments would allow greater restrictions on campaign spending and overturn the court's rulings and ban such laws. Such amendments would have a huge breakthrough and pave the way for adopting laws to rein in outside spending and provide sources for public funding. Full public financing is still the gold standard for getting private money out of elections. Observation 1 is democracy. Private spending dismantles democracy and has a chilling effect on voters. Opposite 2012. Polls from the outside spending up from super PACs has given a significant rise in bipartisan fears of corruption and distrust in government. 1 in 4 Americans are less likely to vote this year due to fears that candidates will cater to the outside interests of super PAC donors over the public interest. Less wealthy, less educated Americans were significantly more likely to say that they would not vote because of super PAC influence. 41% of respondents believe that their vote doesn't matter very much because of donors of big super PACs that have too much influence. And only 1 in 5 Americans agree that voters have the same access to candidates as do to big super PACs. 2 out of 3 Americans, which is 65%, say that the trust in government is less due to big donors than super PACs, and they have more influence than regular voters. American democracy can't survive with the current campaign finance framework. For elections to be fully democratic, several conditions must hold. 1, citizens must have equal amount of power to decide who is elected. And 2, second, elections must be fair races. Americans' elections fail to fulfill both of these criteria because the problem is the way they are financed. The pivotal role that private money plays in elections means that some people don't have a lot of power to determine who wins, and the candidate has unfair advantages. That is not to say that candidates with more money always wins, but money does give candidates a significant edge. Next, public campaign funding is key to democracy. Multiple warrants per fault, 18. It reduces the number of uncontested elections, intense narrow incumbents margins of victory, more contested elections and more close races, fewer landslide re-elections help keep incumbents accountable for their constituents. And 2, it reduces the time and effort candidates need to devote to fundraising and enables them to focus more on direct interactions with voters. And imagine fund jurisdiction, fundraising, and voter contact might be combined, especially in a smaller legislative district.
Oh, you look so cute sitting.
I'm so sorry. Okay. Small donor match tax credit rebate programs allow for small private donations to be more valuable for candidates to broad participation in campaign finance reform. By replacing private contributions with full public funds, full funding programs must be necessary to reduce the large donors on financing elections. Arguments that clean election laws led to reenactment of prescription drug price, bottle control, and bottle deposit law reform, respectively. In those states, a range of other reform measures, for example, in Connecticut, including large college tuition assistance for undocumented immigrants, a transgender rights bill, and paid sick leave mandate. It has also been attributed to clean elections programs. Democracy is key to solving a laundry list of impacts like economic growth, public goods, alliances, and war. The U.S. is key. Lee 2018. Democracy promotion serves a key role in growth and investing in public goods, and will be more politically stable, more dependable allies, and we empirically do not go to war. Democracy doesn't have better mechanisms for protecting private property, and this makes democracy attractive for investors. Entrepreneurship and small business development is key to growing the economy, and democracies tend to be wealthier and more economically stable. Countries less willing to go to war with democracies invest in public goods at higher rates than autocratic governments. Innovation around the world improves the global quality of life between countries. Democracies are regular election cycles ensure established process. Politically stable makes democracies better for international partners and more dependable in other states. Democracies do not go to war with one another, and public constraints leaders' ability to wage war easier to credibility and communicate to resolve the more wealthy and economically interdependent world of democracies is inherently safer. Advantage 2 is IPAC. Private donors influence the presidency and their agenda. Losing them risks future election losses. Goldmaster 21. Biden developed a certain way of thanking his donors who invested in his presidential campaign. He promised to, quote, never, ever let you down. Biden's most loyal contributors found that the top fundraisings are feeling neglected to not outright cast aside, and wealthy and entitled contributors have more influence and access than they currently have, and it's becoming a source of growing concern, where the fear that the party could mobilize and cause backlash. Big donors have scored prominent positions in the administration, including 2 ambassadorships last week, and a hedge fund executive board of the top Democratic donor has communicated that he's pausing his political givings until the voting rights legislation advances. Some party officials worry that the neglect of these early fund years could hamper fundraising in the future. Next is IPAC influences elections through private donation. IPAC's announcement that it would launch a super PAC sent shockwaves throughout the foreign policy community. That now has over $27 million running ads, and it is clear that its spending strategy is to, quote, raise money and spend that money on ads to better suit Democratic candidates who won't question U.S. policy towards Israel. IPAC defended its decision to endorse a single-issue organization. And IPAC advises U.S. politicians to disregard Iran as a regional power, pushing Iran to proliferate, and the U.S. to initiate conflict and war. By an art from January 31st. IPAC implies that the reason for Iran's nuclear progress is that the U.S. has sheathed its sword. IPAC ends its Iran memo by saying, quote, it is declared that it is vital to restore Iran's fear. The letter proposes that the U.S. should immediately begin to act forcefully and, quote, against other Iranian outrages. IPAC is pushing Biden's administration down the path that Trump already took during his campaign of, quote, maximum pressure. The Trump administration launched small attacks against Iran and threatened much larger ones, and Iran responded again and again by speeding up to nuclear progress. After Tehran shot down a U.S. drone, Trump thundered that, quote, any attack by Iran or anything on anything American will be met with obliteration. One of the following months, Tehran announced that it had breached its restrictions on uranium, and in January 2020, Trump assassinated Salimi. Tehran responded roughly 3 weeks later by saying it announced that it possessed more than 6 times as much low-enriched uranium. I'm cutting the card there. Jumping down, that basically with Iran proliferating more nuclear weapons, they have been conducting their military drills, and what ends up happening is if we were to go to war with Iran, that leads to a bigger nuclear war, and eventually can go to a World War III, which would kill us all.
Before I start cross, can I just get exactly where you cut on that last card?
Yeah, right after the end where it says,
And this was Bernard, right?
yeah, the Bernard card where it says IPAC considers U.S. power in the region to morally urges Biden to threaten its attack on Iran.
Copy. Cool. Ready for cross?
Yeah.
Starting now. So first of all, right off the top, how exactly are you defining private spending?
So we're saying that we should ban all private spending for elections. So we're basically saying that any private spending on a presidential campaign specifically would not be allowed anymore.
So are you saying that the presidential candidates themselves cannot spend money from private donors?
On the campaigns, not just the candidate, but the entire campaign. So for example, if I were to give $10,000 to the Biden campaign, he can no longer spend that. Yeah.
But they still get it. They just can't spend it.
Not necessarily. Like, yeah, we can say theoretically, but no one's going to donate money, especially if they can't use it.
Well, we can have. So next question is, how is this affecting super PACs? Can super PACs still be able to?
Yeah, so what we're saying is when we stop people from being able to accept private money, people like IPAC.
When you say accept or spend?
Okay, the U.S. federal government will no longer allow any private spending for presidential campaigns. So in this case, we're saying that IPAC will no longer have pressure on the U.S. government because they can no longer send money.
So their super PACs can no longer function, is what you're trying to say.
That's not exactly what we're saying. What we're saying is that they lose their grip on American federal policy.
Give me the thesis for how they're losing their grip if the super PACs can still function.
Yeah, so what's happening in the cards is saying that IPAC has money. IPAC gives the money to Biden and then says, hey, Biden.
Through the super PAC, or how are they giving the money?
Yes, through the super PAC. And they're saying, here's money for your campaign. And because we're giving you money, we have some fears we want you to look at.
So the super PACs are still able to run as usual. They just are, your theory is they're just not going to want to give money to these candidates because they can't spend.
Not necessarily. We're saying that the whole point is that the super PACs can no longer funnel money into presidential campaigns. And that changes a lot of things, especially right now when we look at.
You just said that they can still donate, it just won't get spent.
So yeah, theoretically you could give them money, but no one's going to give money if you can never use it. It would just be basically depositing it into a bank.
Depositing into bank, cool. And can these candidates still use their own money that was not donated?
Not necessarily. We're saying that when we remove all private spending, we only leave public financing as the only option.
But that wasn't private donations, that's their own money.
Do I need to explain how public finance works?
That's not public financing works.
Okay, so no, they don't get to use their own money because the way public financing works is they say, okay, for example, here's $1,000. You have to spend it on these categories, and you can only spend this money.
Cool.
You can't use your own.
So you're actually just implementing public financing. You're not actually stopping private spending.
Public financing already exists. It wasn't until 2008 when people stopped using it.
Got it. Okay. Cool. I don't need any prep. I'm just gonna go straight into the next speech. Let me upload my doc. Right, gotta close it. That's an important step here. See that? Let me know when you guys have access. Should be popping up. Clear 4.1. There it is. Cool. Thumbs up when judges opponent has access. Cool.
Thank you.
Judges, good. Perfect. Let's get this show on the road, okay? I got 7 minutes on the clock. Everyone's good. 3, 2, 1. Topicality, interpretation. The affirmative must be able to specify increased restrictions on political campaigns, public office in the plain text. The presence of the word on presence means the one restriction modifies the noun phrase. Political campaigns, public office. The aff must limit political campaigns to public office in the area of political engagement, campaign spending, and or description of vacuum, not as effective plan. Restrictions are statutory limits on activity. This is illegal as 2021. Restriction is any activity or is by statute. On Cambridge Dictionary, 2019, a preposition showing what tool instrument system is used to achieve something. Preposition Merriam 2020. A functional word that typically combines with noun phrase and form a phrase which expresses a modification. Political campaigns are those activities specifically engaged for the purpose of influencing election for office. Law in 2022, political campaigns means activities engaged for the purpose of influencing the outcome of an election for office. We're going to go to the violation step here. So our articulation here is the fact that they're trying to say they're now going to be affecting the super PACs because they're extra topical on the violation step. So they're having now influence things and affect things outside of the public campaign. They're no longer just putting these restrictions on public campaigns or political campaigns. They are now putting it on outside groups of the super PACs. That is the only way that they are able to garner these solvency, these impacts, and these advantages. We'll get into that more on case. The plan mandates a restriction on another party outside political campaign. One is attempt to restriction on outside parties on top of the plan is topical by the fact. The mandate must be on political campaign direct and not eventually lead to a restriction on the campaign. The interpretation is effects topical at best. Going to standards. Correct about orange was criminal ground because this is on grammatical education, always in resolution. Orange was allowed and this is specified in the word and topic to consider topical. Limits orange was adding place after resolution to account background. This is limited to what the African mandate and that is the words of the resolution. Everything else is topical and they are plan of act and distribution mixes the word solvency and means that they are only topical as they likely to solve. Orange arbitrary determine topicality as TS office should be evaluated as separate issues. Often it looked like just how their plan text is kind of super vague and like you actually have to go into the solvency to really see how it functions. Going to the voters, rules of LD, NFA-LD, they're super required rules in LD to vote negative if they believe that they're not topical. Failure to vote must be choice for certification, topicality, they get reissue, meaning they violate intuition means that they lose access to in-depth discussion necessary for robust topical education. For frequently to using because there's no clear way to determine reasonable interpreters usually assume the media failure near spinners and the interpreters unreasonable let it fall. But we're in a case. We're gonna have a DA at the bottom. The parametricization down to presidential election guts their solvency when a lot of this corruption they're trying to say they solve for also happens in congressional elections. Don't let them try to backfill and say that they solve for the corruption in congressional elections because they don't. So they pretty much can only now try to solve for presidential elections, and like most of the corruption is actually the lawmaking body. Going to the congressional elections are just as important, if not more so. The advantages are both based on stopping super PACs. These are exterior organizations affecting them through abuse, or it is circulated as we're going to circumvented, not circumvented. The type of restriction is unconstitutional for status will be struck down. National Conference State Legislature in February 2019. Public financing of elections is believed to ensure that political government has outsized influence on the outcome of an election. There is an essential improvement in our system of conducting campaign health financing is the least used method of raising money in elections. Partly the result of the Supreme Court decision in Buckley v. Vallejo. In that decision, the court struck down a provision of the Federal Election Commission mandating public financing for presidential elections. When they are in effect making it to not have to go to public financing, that is the same thing that got struck down. Zombie account loopholes, the former candidates using the funding for purposes of the election are not solved when candidates will still be bought. Michael Bennett, November 4, 2021. These zombie accounts are problematic when former election officials work with lobbying firms. It is perfectly legal for elected officials to become lobbyists and make these donations to their old campaign accounts and go colleagues to jurisdiction over areas of direct interest in the candidate compliance. These funds can also help consulting fund members to continue receiving paychecks from the campaign account long after the election is over. Former members of Congress who registered as foreign agents often use their old campaign accounts to contribute to the same legislators that were lobbying on their behalf of foreign governments like Saudi Arabia. Apply that directly to their second advantage when we still see that this corruption is going to be happening from foreign affairs. Public financing is a failure. It is not visible to keep up with times. Even Bernie calls it a disaster. Cannot solve under the flawed system that other part. Kathy Keeley, February 9, 2016. Even Bernie Sanders has made the limiting political influence of wealthy court tenant of his campaign. He called the program a disaster. Nobody can become president based on that system. It's basically dead. Public financing is growing popular with the candidates because the amount of money it offers them, which is indexed to inflation, has kept up with the Tory present campaign given or in which by the private owners have discovered that certain themselves in the campaigns. And circumvention argument, this one is key. Start this one on your flow. Terminal solvency. The after proposals needed to complement campaign finance law. Both the donors can and will influence elections. Laws don't matter unless they're enforced. Mass 2014. Still simply others worry that the amount of money being spent is unsafe. Even if seen, it would be better spent on almost any other city, regardless of motivates. The campaign finance law becoming various instruction and the cost of votes level government over the year has been almost uniformly a failure. This interpretation here is that the campaign finance law has become hopelessly complicated. And some of the transparency is gone. If you want to know who's supporting each other, candidate, the question is largely unanswerable. Donors are paying close attention to the laws to figure out how to get their money to the campaigns and need them without running foul of the authorities. Donors still want to give money and candidates still want to spend it, so they'll figure out a way to get money where they want to go. Circumvention is possible through super PACs, and enforcement is poor. Limiting the campaign's funding does nothing. Tim Lau, December 12, 2019. The outside groups could accept unlimited contributions from both individual donors and corporations as long as they don't give directly to the candidates. These outright groups were still promoted to spend money on independently produced ads and other communications that will promote or attack specific candidates, and while super PACs are technically prohibited from coordinating directly with candidates, weak coordination rules have often proven effective. Campaign spending, this is going to be a turn on our democracy. Campaign spending, political participation, the increase in campaign finance has diversified the ballot and spending free speech and benefited democracy overall. Reforms for censorship and reduction of political participation. Blackburn does 20. The prevalence of new voices in political years since the decisions on the title clearly seems highly likely that the power to move money and interest with the figure on the skills of the election to see reality posted to the would have sought. Supporters of Cincinnati, far from believing the decisions hinder democratic ideals regarded as a boon for democracy, allowing political access more easily challenging governments. While right to rise brought a lot of ads, has failed to convince many voters. Super PACs supporting newcomers and had better success as groups like Independent USA, PAC, and Women Vote. The 5 elections since it's on average 79 freshmen. The 5 cycles prior to the decision saw 5.5. Cut down the bottom. Decision guidance is one of the most important decisions of the century for protecting, fostering, and benefiting American democracy. Going down to the democracy thesis being false. Campaign financing democracy doesn't influence trust in government. It's a red herring and can affect perception. Primo Milo, 2020. The campaign finance is misunderstood by voters as well as the policymakers, the media, and political analysts. Most political officers would agree that super PACs are various influence, and that is accurate. Primo Milo spread to 4,000 Americans in 2016 and 150 experts in 2017. They all collected survey data on trust and confidence in government, spending 3 decades to study the effects in campaign finance law on trust. They also include that changes in state level plans have little to no effects on attitudes towards government. It calls the question. Okay, just cut there. I'm going to try to see what I can get real quick. Alas, no solvency. Enforcement fails. The federal election committee is intensely gridlocked. There's no meaningful consequence to breaking campaign finance law 2019. The FEC is evenly divided between Democrats and Republicans, and notoriously dysfunctional to the process for issuing new laws that virtually gone to a halt. And Democrats want to pursue most significant campaign finance violations, often receiving allegations for years without even an investigation. The commission's been set with minutes of there has been a permanent general counsel for more than 5 years. Let's get into my elections real quick, see how much you can do. Trump's likely to lose the nomination. Trump losing the nomination loses lead to a split in the Republican Party, causing a Biden win. Jeff 2020, Trump is running across the party. Joe Biden using a reproof of the 2020 contest. Just as 17-12, neither party can afford to split itself. 7 now some Republicans in 1912 split Republicans even more. Little despair in the country, so even split between red and blue, and Democratic indeed and Democrat win. Donald Trump will ultimately denigrate any former supporters and friends in the pursuit of his goal on TR as well. He doesn't accept defeat well. Cut right there. Go. The big test for the candidates whether they can attract enough big donors to overcome Trump's grassroots donors remain viable, or the donors are looking to consolidate behind DeSantis as a consensus Trump alternative. Plan hinders the GOP strategy of overcoming Trump alternative. Caution 2023. The battle of the Republican Party failure is a clash between the interests of big donors and grassroots voters. Trump will maintain a stronghold on populists. Cool. Kroshner, 2003, or 23.
Okay, is anybody not ready for cross? All right. So first we go on this whole journey about talking about like how we're not solving for Congress, right?
Yep.
So what is the point of all that if we're not talking about in our case at all for anything Congress? We specifically focus on presidential elections. So what was the whole point of this Congress bid?
Because your whole idea of your democracy advantage, like the idea of the trust and government, the whole ideal, and the thesis of that, part of that is the lawmaking body of the U.S. would have to be fixed. And if you're not actually paying any attention to the Congress's corruption, then you just fail to get any kind of solvency from, Congress still being able to be bought, sold, super PACs outside of
Okay, so what you're getting at is saying that, are you, correct me if I'm wrong, but are you saying that we can't pass the plan because of Congress? Is that what I'm getting from it?
I'm saying you'll have a solvency deficit without which getting any of your impacts because you do not actually fix the lawmaking body of the United States. Your choice to parametricize down to the presidential election causes problems with solvency.
Okay, cool. So let's talk about okay, so we have this whole talk about calling public financing a disaster, right? And no one can ever win a presidential campaign, right?
Yeah.
So when you look at it, was there ever times that people would win on public financing that didn't involve private spending?
This just articulates pretty much that it has due to the fact it's based off of inflation rates, it hasn't been able to keep up with the amount of money that is needed to actually fund a campaign.
Gotcha. And why did people shift away from public financing?
outside donation interest groups. But it
Gotcha.
doesn't solve the root problem of it being fixed on inflation, the amount of money they're getting.
Okay, so
Which,
when we get to the whole part talking a little bit about IPAC and its influence, right? The super PACs, can you explain that a little more to me? You're saying that super PACs?
if you look to
still
your link
exist?
card there, the super PAC that was like created through the IPAC, how you actually have to be able to solve for those problems,
Yeah.
you would have to like pretty much get rid of their ability to function, which my articulation is you are not able to do that as they are exterior organizations and they can still have their own private campaigns and their own private ways to influence elections without ever having to give a dime to a candidate.
Yeah, so how do super PACs have major influence? If they're able to make such a big impact to begin with, why do they funnel the money into the campaigns?
Because they also create their own pseudo campaigns, their own smear campaigns against the candidates they want to lose. And all they gotta do is let the candidate they know that they want to win, that, hey, they're doing all this effort for them and they're still effectively in their pocket. Also, you do not stop them from giving money. As you said in process, you just stop them from spending that money they were given. Like you said, it gets stored in a bank.
Yeah, exactly. They give them money, but they can't spend it. So what's the
It's like a
point?
millionaire giving me $100 or $1 million. Why go over $100 million? Millionaire giving me $1 million and say, you can't spend it for a couple of years, but here you go. I'm still gonna get bought. And he'll still be able to help me get my campaign without ever actually having to like let me spend that money on the campaign. He can make his own private smear campaigns for me. He can do all the help he wants. But then down the road, I'm still going to be supporting this guy's beliefs because he just gave me $1 million.
Gotcha. Thank you. All right, I will take running break. So we're gonna go T in on case. Is anybody not ready?
Any cards?
The one, just the new doctors, not specific. All right, then we will begin. So first on the answer to the T, the plan is not extra topical. They do not specify which part of the plan is untopical. They act as if there is multiple elements to the plan, but we only need to defend one plan action and its impacts, not the effect. It is not effectually topical as the link chain is predictable and we have proven our standards. One, we meet. Nowhere in the plan does it say that we mandate a specific party. There are violations clearly say general, that we have to mandate a specific party. Their interpretation is bad for education debate because we can't imagine new ideas for this interpretation. It would make every debate boring and impossible for an affirmative to win, and no case would be inherent with every act would already exist in the school. On voters, default to reasonability. If my interpretation makes sense and is reasonable, that's good enough. There is no abuse. There are no arguments on the case, and there's a disad. There's no reason for you to pull the trigger on T. Competing interpretation is bad because it leads to a race to eliminate every possible AF case. Also, even if you buy that, my interpretation of the topic is better on this subject. They limit out a majority of possible affirmative cases, including their own. We look at what they say on the T violations are, that the plan mandates a restriction on another party outside political campaigns. The one he sees attempt to restrict is outside the party, not topical. However, if we bring up the exact definition of the resolution, or the exact resolution, it says, resolve the United States federal government should substantially increase restrictions on political campaigns in public office in one of the following areas, one of which is campaign spending. So the running for public office is the president, and we are restricting their spending. We are very much on the topic. Next, we also see a bunch of these ideas talking about how we don't solve for Congress and there are zombie accounts and loopholes. Essentially, what is happening with the app is we are no longer allowing America to be, especially presidential candidates, to be controlled by super PACs. What is happening in the IPAC advantage is saying, hey, right now, IPAC is funneling a bunch of money into the Biden campaign. And what that does is give them influence on it. We saw that they are scoring prominent seats in his offices. We saw it just a few weeks ago when we talked about it in the app. We then see they're making adjustments and saying that, hey, we want to sponsor you because you're not going to question our policies towards Iran. And then we imply, IPAC implies the reason for Iran's nuclear progress is that the U.S. has sheathed its sword against it. They are very specifically trying to cause a problem because they think that Iran is becoming an issue for them. We saw it before, and this is something tangible and feasible we can look at. During the campaign of maximum pressure, it started off simple. There was a drone that was shot down. Next thing you know, we've assassinated somebody, and 3 weeks after that, they have made 6 times as much enriched uranium. That's a really big deal, and something you can tangibly see. As we start looking at how that specifically links to the topic, it's not that they're going to still be able to just put money in the bank for the candidate to use later. No, theoretically, yes, they can still give that candidate money, but that money can never be used. It can never, ever be used on a political campaign or any kind of spending for that presidential candidate. It's essentially just putting money under your mattress. We try and get me in this weird lock-in process saying like, oh, they're going to put in money in the bank and they're going to use it later. That's not at all what's happening. Now, if we look at some of the things my opponent says in their case, specifically targeting public financing, where they quoted this Bernie card saying that financing is a disaster, and a big reason that no one can run on it is due to inflation. Now, why can't anybody run on it today? Well, the biggest reason is because right now there is an alternative. They can make more money if they use private spending. However, when we eliminate that, that leaves it as the only option. That's why we saw in multiple election cycles from 1976 to 96 and up to 2008 that people would always use this funding, and that was the best option for them. It's not you can do both, it's you pick or you choose. And when we eliminate it all, that's what allows a lot more people to get upward mobility. We see in the democracy advantage that starts to come about. And this whole argument saying the democracy thesis saying it doesn't increase trust in the government is exactly what we are accomplishing here. We're saying that right now, because of super PAC influence on presidencies, 66% of Americans don't want to vote, and that's a big deal. Instead, you prefer public financing, where people are only given specific sets of money, everyone's given the same amount of money based on your campaign, and then you spend it how you want to. Now, not only does that increased trust in American elections, that brings democracy as a whole into a much better light for other countries around us. We saw in the Lee 18 card that it not only solves the argument of like the voter turnout chilling effects, but economic growth, public goods, alliances, and war. That democracy promotion serves a key role in growth, that people want to invest in America when we are a better democracy, when we are a stronger democracy. That people are less empirically likely to go to war with us when we do this. So not only are we, one, stopping a potential war with Iran, but B, stopping any potential wars in the future. On an impact scenario, that's a really, really big deal. Now, let's move over to the opponent's beginning of their disadvantage. Their disadvantage only started with Nick Michelle saying that the 2024 election disadvantage, how a Democrat will win. But then they ran out of time. So any more talk on a disadvantage can't flow through because I will not have adequate time to respond to it. So they started to provide a disadvantage, which is why the T doesn't go through, because they had the opportunity to and they started to, but they didn't finish that disad. So that disad will immediately fall. Now, when you compare all those things, if you believe the T for the AF side, the AF wins the debate. One, because we show you that in the resolve itself, we give a specific example for public office, which we said is the president, in the specific sector of interest groups, campaign financing, or I'm sorry, I don't remember the other one, but political communication, campaign spending, or interest groups. We pick presidency and we pick campaign spending. Those are in the options of the exact resolution, and that's why I urge an affirmative ballot.
I'll take my 4 minutes prep. Starting that out. review the roadmap real quick off 10. We'll be starting on the T-shell. Overview, T-shell, and then we'll be getting into the mountain that is going to be on case. Sound good, everyone? Judges all good? Thumbs up? Yep. Going good? There is no new documents. We're just going to reference stuff throughout. And I will try to call out author names as I can, or at the very least highlights. 3, 2, 1. It should be an easy vote for the negative of today's debate when they completely drop like half of the stuff I read against them on case, and they drop some actually offensive terms. The key cards you're going to be looking at in this debate are going to be Masket, Blackburn, the turn, FEC's dropped card on enforcement, and Tim Lau's card. First of all, let's start on the T-shell. They say no proven abuse and reasonable. And my whole articulation of this T-shell that they mishandled in the violation step was that the proven abuse would be them stopping the super PACs because those are an outside organization. They can stop the campaign spending. We'll allow them that in the resolution, but they cannot stop these outside organizations from spending money towards these campaigns. They tried to say logically, well, they won't give them money if they're not going to be able to spend it on the campaign. They're still going to buy them, which is actually what my circulation Tim Lau argument says. They'll just go around them and do their own campaigns. And my other one says that they'll get money to them whether they can spend it or not. And that's because they want those candidates in their pocket. We'll be getting into the line by line on that. So at the end of the day, Judge, you should be voting nay on presumption due to the drop solvency takeouts, and you'll likely be voting nay on the risk of the DA that was just blatantly waved away because I did get a link out of it. Let's start going down the on-case flow. First of all, Bernie. They say, well, anybody can't run it because of the fact that they're getting all this money. They completely dropped the part of the Bernie card where it says that the reason the public financing thing fails is because it's based off of an inflation rate and hasn't been able to keep up with the necessary funds needed to run a campaign. So anybody who is just going to be reliant on this public financing program is going to be shot in the foot before they can even start their campaign because they will not have enough money from this to be able to run. The end of that card literally calls out the fact that the public program has not kept up. My opponent tries to get up and say, well, they'll make the program better. That's extra T. Vote on the T. On that note, though, let's just keep going down. The zombie accounts, they pretty much say that theoretically, and they cannot use the money. If you look into that zombie card that I read there, they literally point out how even after the elections were over, they were literally paying their family members and consultants and all these other people money from this fund that was never supposed to be touched outside of a campaign. They're not supposed to touch outside of a campaign as it is, but they're going to justify it by like saying, I'm going to give some money to my friend, I'm going to give some money, consultant money for my other friend, and there is no enforcement on this. And that is what this is going to come down to, is the dropped enforcement specs. They completely dropped my SCOTUS argument. I pointed out that their plan forcing these candidates to use public financing is untopical and will be struck down by SCOTUS. There was no response. How can they have solvency if immediately after they pass it, it's immediately struck down by SCOTUS? Don't let them get up and respond with any kind of perceptual links. They had their chance in their last speech, and they're just behind the ball on solvency. Keeping going down the flow, they also dropped my whole wealthy donors, the Masket card, and the circumvention Tim Lau card. The wealthy donors one is key when it literally points out how we have done these kind of financial reforms in the past, and that the wealthy donors always find a way to work around it because the enforcement is so poor, just as it will be post-affirmative plan. Also, onto the circumvention argument, they completely dropped this one when that card, Tim Lau, points out about how these super PACs are able to run their own pseudo smear campaigns and get the candidate that they want in office. Sure, even if you're buying the idea that they can't give them money directly, then you should be buying the fact that now they can just go around that obstacle and just continue to make their own campaigns to get the candidate they want in office, their president, and then they still win. Last thing, the thing that they dropped also was the FEC gridlock, that literally FEC, who is supposed to be enforcing these kind of policies, sit on the issues for years and years and years before even making a decision whether they're going to pursue an investigation. That was also dropped. So at the end of the day, my opponent truly has no solvency. And let's go down into the advantage. They try to argue my democracy thesis false is functionally dropped. They try to say, well, that's exactly what we're trying to accomplish, but they completely drop my articulation of people don't actually care about the campaign reform. They don't care about the financial reform. That's not the key issue when it comes to defending democracy and the trust in government and bolstering democracy. Also on this card, I want to also cross-apply the argument I made about they don't affect Congress. How are other countries going to respect our democracy when it's only the president that they have parametricized down to, and the lawmaking body where a lot of this corruption and lobbying is happening is not even affected by the plan? So why would people care? They pretty much mishandle the democracy thesis being false argument. And last, on their whole super PACs, the Israel argument, they say that pretty much the super PACs funneling money into Biden's campaign. Refer to my zombie one. People can still be bought even if they're not necessarily using that money immediately. And with the poor enforcement, you have no way of proving they're not using that money immediately. And by the time it's found out, it's years down the road and a slap on the wrist. Last, let's talk about the T. They blipped us away saying I didn't get to read the whole thing. I still got to read that current uniqueness is a toss-up right now. DeSantis is ahead due to his supporters, and that if plan passes, it allows for the potential for a Trump presidency. That's really problematic. I don't know about you, but I don't want another 4 years of Trump. Sorry. But that should also be a negative impact that is only risked under the plan. Don't let them come up and try to respond to my articulation. Yeah, it's just an analytical that I got to read off the claim, but they still should have given it some weight and said something. Because I don't know about you, but a Trump presidency sounds pretty bad. So at the end of the day, Judge, you're voting nay because they truly have no solvency. They have no way to solve. They have no way to enforce post-affirmative plan. And if they try to say, well, they stopped the super PACs because they're like fiating this like stopping of spending, that's proven abuse on the team. But you really should be voting nay on presumption because they don't solve and you only risk bad things happening by attempting to pass this. Thank you.
I'll start my last one. Okay. Is anybody not ready? Okay. Then I will begin now. So, our exact resolution allows for us to go to quote public office in one of three subsections. We eliminate campaign spending. This was clear. There was clear room for the negative to get up and read a dis-ad. They even started to. However, they ran out of time, so it doesn't flow through. But as my mother would say, the proof is in the pudding because they can and they started to read a dis-ad. The room was there for the T. You have to vote, quote, and in their violation of voters, they were very general. Their three voters were, quote, you have to vote neg because 1, you have to, 2, you have to, and 3, because of reasonable interp. The reasonable interp is we took subsections of the resolution as they actually were saying. Now, the T argument only goes through if and only if you allow the negative to misconstrue everything the AF said. So, for example, they're saying we are failing the super PACs because we don't eliminate the super PACs altogether. That is correct, because if we were to eliminate the super PACs altogether, that would be extra T. Then they say we fail because the whole zombie argument saying that the constituents can still funnel money into other people. We are not extra T, but if I kept you from giving them to family money, that would be extra T. Now, they say a big argument here is that the Supreme Court would strike down, and I can't reply to it. It says in my case, there's normal means. It's literally durable fiat. It is that simple, that we are allowed to pass something. Now, I want to start talking about democracy, because that is the only thing that is left in this debate when you vote for the T on the app. The whole argument of democracy, my opponent claims that it falls because they say with their evidence that voters don't actually get more trust in America. If you look at the cards, that's not what the democracy is saying. The impact is that economically, we boom when people want to invest in us, that we are less empirically likely to go to war when you look at the democracy advantage. it's a plus that people will gain more trust and want to vote. However, that's not the big one. That's why that wasn't tagged as the impact card in of itself. Now, when we finally look at the other advantage, there is no real pushback on APAC, especially when we see what it actually does. When we stop them from being able to have direct influence on Biden's policies and the people in his office right now that happened 2 weeks ago, we see that we will not go and push Iran any more than we already have. You can tangibly see it. We did it already, and they're now enriching uranium. It's a big deal. Prefer the impacts, the extinction impacts, and allowing America not only prevent an upcoming war or any wars in the future when we become more democratic. That's a big thing. You know, we empirically will not go to war, our economics boom, and that more people want to stay with democracy and invest in us as a country. And therefore, informed about it.
Being social hospitality.
Social.
Oh, social. Am I not in your class? Yeah, it's going back to me. Right.
We're gonna kill the stream.
Thanks for watching.